"You don't seem married," the astrologer said. I had settled myself in a comfortable armchair, Daisy at my feet. I gave the famous man my birth date when I made the appointment. Now I offered a few introductory comments about myself, plus full disclosure of my husband's Virgo-ish view of both astrology and credit card debt, mine. The losses steadily piling up in my life, the friend disruptions, the worklessness, not to mention the vision thing. The ophthalmologist said early macular degeneration. I pointed to the eye patch I'd been wearing all week. "Can the planets tell if I'm going to lose my sight?" I asked the astrologer. His non sequitur of an observation stopped me. Was not seeming married a compliment? An insult? Something else? Daisy's head rested on crossed paws. He hadn't even asked me her name. "You seem up for anything," he continued, in the same affectless voice, like you're ready to give your phone number to whomever asks. Okay, it was an insult. I knew because my cheeks burned. It was true. I was up for anything. On the other hand, no one had proposed much of anything. "I keep wondering, what will I leave behind?" I said. I was just making conversation now. Did I care if I left anything behind? "Children," he said. "No children," I said. God, I hadn't even thought of children as a thing I wouldn't be leaving behind. Not that I had thought of leaving anything behind, though now it crossed my mind that Harry's daughter didn't need to inherit all those little blue spiral notebooks filled with decades of dreams. I wasn't only workless, I was also childless, a childless woman. But that sounded pathetic, a way I didn't feel. I used to be a well-regarded teacher. My field was fashion and textile history, I told him, sounding artificial and defensive. It's hard to see my way forward without work. Now I pictured the ferociously talented young Sri Lankan woman who had become the darling of the small academic world I once inhabited, the newest go-to scholar on female costume and its various intellectual tributaries. Gorgeous, too. I envy these talented young immigrants in New York, I continued with appalling disingenuousness. It's their world now. Yuck. Who was I? Still, it had felt like a body blow when that young woman replaced me at Parsons. The astrologer shrugged. You're an emigre too, he said. I stared back at him. You're an emigre from youth. An image of the crowded shelves in my bathroom medicine cabinet popped up. My facial serums were going to outlive me for sure. When I mentioned my long-dead mother and the haunting I continue to feel even now, a lifetime later, the astrologer perked up. When would I learn to keep my dead mother out of the conversation? Dead mother, dead mother. It was reflexive, like reciting my Amex number or zip code. Her birthday, he wanted to know, date of death. I told him that I had grown up believing my mother had been killed by a hit and run, by a stranger when I was a baby, that I was 24 before I heard the real story. He checked his watch. Well, tell me that, he said. An hour later, I was back in my lobby, waiting for the elevator with Daisy, when I became aware that standing a few feet away from me, also waiting, was the man I'd noticed dining near Harry and me at Gotham the other night. The elevator doors opened, the man waited for Daisy and me to enter first, and when the doors closed, we three were alone together. So, how was dinner, he said, with blunt familiarity and the same frank, sexually curious stare. Now it clicked into place. This must be Rosen, the famous painter. Nathan Rosen? Bernard? One of those last name personages. I recalled someone telling me years ago that he kept an apartment in the building, but I'd never laid eyes on him. He'd been notorious once for his Balthus-like portraits of prepubescent girls, But unlike Balthus, Rosen's palette was luridly colored. He'd been known as well for the womanizing and general carousing typical of the late 1970s. Intelligence and humor in his eyes, and something I hadn't felt directed toward me in a long time, sexual curiosity. I liked it. I wondered if it was mutual. The man had to be in his late 70s. Was it possible to feel attracted to an old man? Then I remembered my own age and the devastatingly sexy Leonard Cohen's. Oh. I find your paintings complicated and disturbing, I said. Jesus, had I ever once had a single thought about his paintings? Just then, one of them conjured itself in my mind, a young girl confined in a small space, a large tiger half seen. I met his gaze with my one good eye. Also, a little silly. He responded with a big barking laugh. When the elevator doors opened, we properly introduced ourselves, though our small elevator flirtation seemed to have turned us into co-conspirators. You should come for tea, he said. 4 o'clock. Bring your dog. No eye patch, said Solomon Rosen when he opened the door of his apartment 3 floors above mine. He studied me. I kind of miss it. Standing on his threshold with Daisy, I again felt that dizzying force field of collusion, that something that masquerades as intimacy but is actually something else. What else? I was always forgetting. Come in. Less light than in my apartment, sparsely furnished, larger though, maybe 2 apartments combined. 2 huge bubble-wrapped objects that looked as if they had to be canvases leaned against a wall in the entryway. No art on the walls, no clutter, not so much thoughtfully minimalist as minimally lived in. I wondered if he was rich. Do you actually live here? I said. I made my way to a dark leather sofa and sat down. When I unclipped Daisy's leash, she trotted off to sniff her way around the place. A pang of guilt for bringing my dog as witness to whatever was going to happen. A girl leaves her house, gets into a car, walks into a room. He stood over me, smiling. I do when I'm in New York, which is more and more infrequently. Can I get you tea? Please. He disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen. I got up to follow, then changed my mind and sat down again. Then I stood and walked to a window, disoriented by the view from this side of the building. I remembered how, as a child on sleepover nights at a friend's house, I'd lie in the dark with my eyes shut and try to convince myself that I was really at home in my own bed. I'd mentally rearrange the furnishings behind my closed lids until I could believe I was in that other familiar reality. I was always surprised by how difficult this mental geography was to achieve and hold on to. The actual reality, outside my closed eyes, kept insisting on itself. The furniture and walls stubbornly remained where they were, no matter how hard I tried to believe them into that other arrangement. Rosen returned with a lacquered tray holding a small teapot, 2 mugs, a plate of actual cookies. He set it down on the small table in front of the sofa, then sat down himself. Daisy did a nose-quivering inspection of the tray, then settled with a soft groan at Rosen's feet. I had 2 of these dogs when I was a kid, he said. Sweet animals. He reached down and scratched Daisy's ear. Where was that? St. Louis. My father was a psychiatrist. My mother committed suicide, jumped from the roof of the house when I was, 16. Of course, he had said those same words hundreds of times to who knows how many women. I wondered if he felt them anymore. Where are your people from? He asked me. Ohio, the suburbs. My mother died when I was a baby. My father 5 years ago. Did I feel those words? Today I did. But how much autobiography was necessary in an affair at our age? Also, was this that? He poured a cup of tea for me. His hands were large and graceful, and I couldn't stop looking at them. Happily married, he said. My parents? My face felt hot. Well, no, I meant you. Yes. What about you? 3 times. Children, I said. 2 sons. And then we were silent. I was grateful that he didn't ask if I had children or grandchildren, because what fascinating possibilities could lie on the far side of those obligatory niceties? Daisy had rolled onto her back, and now Rosen obligingly reached down to give her a tummy rub. I watched as his fingers tickled and scratched, then patiently caressed her, stem to stern. I'd never cheated on Harry, not once in our 2 decades together. I noticed you some time ago, last winter maybe, Rosen was saying. He was wearing a rumpled jacket over a worn-looking chambray shirt and jeans. His face was kind of jowly, and his eyes had bags under them, but his skin was smooth. A man who moisturized. I'm in New York irregularly, but I passed you once or twice in the lobby. He paused. I find you very attractive. Sexy. And there was the boyish grin from the restaurant. His seduction technique, resting as it did on his acknowledgement that it was, of course, a technique, was not unlikable. I used to be considered something of an expert at this, he added. He needn't have, but it afforded a tiny glimpse of vulnerability, intended or not, and it steadied me, made me forget for a moment that for men, famous trumped old. There were women far younger than I who'd be drawn to such a man. Still, I felt flattered. So I've heard. What do you do besides wifery, he said. I told him, including the vintage clothing store I'd had until the obscene rent hike drove me out of business last summer. So I guess wifery is pretty much it for now, I said with self-mocking brightness. Daisy was lying right side up, front paws still crossed, her tea party pose, watching us carefully. And doggery. Silence. What's going through that head of yours, he said. His face wore a different sort of smile now. Was it fondness? Female trouble, I said. My friendships have been imploding like crazy. Was that on my mind right then? I doubted it. But who could say? My limbic system was too loud. Go on, I'm interested. So I told him how the confusing changes went all the way back to the days just before the Iraq War, when I couldn't figure out if I was for it or against. How the 3 friends, solidly against, were horrified. The truth was, I felt as contrary and disagreeable as an adolescent in those early menopausal days. I didn't tell Rosen that, containing as it did the word menopausal. Nor did I tell him how Harry had found my disagreeableness endearing and called me hands-on-hips girl, containing as it did the name Harry. I did tell him how Natalie and Eve and Tessa had seemed certain about everything back then. How once, standing in line at the movies with Eve, I'd remarked that I wasn't sure if examining the unconscious ever really helped anyone, and that Freud was just a man. Well, once again, we disagree, she had said, in a clipped tone. How I couldn't remember a history of disagreement with Eve. I spoke about the evening Tessa invited me to the ballet. We were eating delicious guacamole at a restaurant beforehand, and when Iraq came up, a weariness came over me to think of a week's worth of op-ed pieces she and I were about to repeat to each other, as if we had just formed those thoughts right there in Rosa Mexicana. Well, what would you do if you were president, I had asked her. I meant it too, I told Rosen. I mean, I hated that president as much as anyone did. Now I wondered if I had meant it. Could I have been goading her? Why? How dare you, Tessa had answered, and called for the check. I didn't tell him the Natalie story. It shamed me to remember it. Natalie had come by with her small granddaughter, and I had made a tart. When I cut and served the pieces, rather sloppily, Natalie had said, "Oh, Isabelle, you don't have a maternal bone in your body." Rosen's arm had found its way around the back of the sofa, and his hand, all 5 fingers of it, was cupping the back of my neck. I met his eyes, and a permission-requested, permission-granted look was exchanged. A Leonard Cohen lyric came to me. All I ever learned of love was how to shoot at someone who outdrew you. Quoting song lyrics to myself, I was definitely in trouble now. "Is it true you tried to strangle one of your wives in the Cedar Tavern?" said the woman, pretending to be me. His expression acknowledged this as the flip deflection it was, and he rightly ignored it. Then we kissed, and for a pretty long while, too. No rush kissing. As it went on, as I gave in to the slipping down swoon of it, I tried to decide if I was attracted to him. I wasn't not attracted to him. Kissing. I was waiting for my mind and my body to arrive at some kind of mutual decision. Who knew how long that could take? "However long it takes," the kissing said, and I let myself let it take me over, like falling under the spell of a great book or a piece of music, but, as everyone knows, way better. Now he was closing the remaining sliver of space between us on the sofa. Our bodies were making preliminary contact. His hands were getting to know me. Was the kissing part over already? The first disappointment. I disentangled myself. "I like this kissing," I said. I took a sip of my tea, cold now. "I'm just not certain I want to, whatever this is. Ugh. The last way I wanted to sound, to be, was coy. But what was the first way?" I barreled on. "My libido is shot," I heard myself say, matter-of-factly. "A combination of antidepressants and rage. I mean age." There. I felt both more confident and more vulnerable speaking the truth, or at least a truth. I warmed to my own bravado. You know that scene in Some Like It Hot where Tony Curtis is dressed up as the pretend yacht owner, and he tells Marilyn Monroe that kissing does nothing for him, and she takes it as a challenge? Rosen was listening to this small speech with probably more attention than it deserved. Maybe it was that, the engaged focus of his attention, that made it necessary for me to push myself away and, facing him, straddle his lap, my knees digging into the sofa on either side of his thighs. I wrapped my arms around his neck and proceeded to kiss him in earnest. Being in charge of the kissing made me think I might be attracted to him after all. A husband and a lover, if not in one man, why not in one building? Isn't that what every woman secretly wanted? Elsewhere in my head, I was saying these words in exactly that way, to Natalie, Eve, and Tessa, framing the vignette of my Solomon Rosen story for them. Another reflex. No, I wouldn't tell them. Dead mother, dead mother, dead mother. I unbuttoned the top button of Rosen's shirt and the one below it, licked his skin, inhaled his male smell. The 3 friends disappeared, and I stopped wondering anything at all. The doorbell rang, one long, loud peal. I about flew through the ceiling. Now I was going to be arrested, or worse. "Fuck," he said. Another long peal. Rosen checked his watch. "I should go," I said to the teacups. I stood, rearranged my clothes. "I'm going to have to deal with this," he said. He stood too, rather stiffly, then kissed the top of my head, benediction style. "Yes, you'd better go." Now he was walking me efficiently through the kitchen and toward a different door, not the door I had entered the apartment through earlier, and Daisy was trotting along behind us. "I'll call you tomorrow. We can start over," he said. "Do me a favor. Count to 10 before you open the door." He left me there, counting, and it wasn't until Daisy and I were out in the no-man's land of the hall again, and whoever had rung the other doorbell had been ushered in, presumably through the door I'd entered earlier, and the elevator had arrived and deposited us back on our own floor, and I was unlocking my door, my heart beating overtime, that I realized I had left Daisy's leash in Rosen's apartment, and that I was still counting.